They told me the rails were dead. Then, at 11:11, the timetable blinked open and breathed. Listen, if the bells strike wrong tonight, something old will arrive, and it will ask for you. The wind came first, tasting of iron filings and wet stone, herding clouds across the viaduct. Like black sheep, I ran because the hourglass inside the cracked chronometer was bleeding its last grains, and because guilt runs faster than courage until it trips. The Wayhouse lanterns were ribs without lungs, chiming glass against glass as the quarter bells flinched out of sequence. Then the whistle answered, high, thin, and impossibly near, and the iron road revealed itself like a scar reopening. Out of fog and history rolled the night engine, a procession of windows replaying prayers. A figure in a black coat stepped to the platform, white gloves bright as teeth. He did not speak. He only lifted a stamped ticket toward me, a small red word making a noose around my throat. I reached, heart double-timing the bells, and the hour decided whether to keep me or kill me. The town below pretended to sleep, yet every shutter had an eye. I walked the switchback stairs with the ticket biting my palm like a small animal determined not to be forgotten. The towers argued in metal tongues, quarter bells yawning out of order, and the rooftops repeated their quarrel to the alleys. In the archive, dust rose like judges when I opened ledgers that smelled of vinegar and fear. The ink had been corrected in a careful hand, times nudged, weights trimmed, names pushed into margins where darkness eats truth. A footprint of quicksilver dulled the leather, a smear refusing to dry after all these years. Behind me, a tool bag clicked, a familiar cadence of glass vials and copper, and the air grew sharper as if a knife had entered the room just to listen. I told the room I had taken nothing. The ticket pulsed warm through cloth like a hidden ember, and the bells reset themselves with an embarrassed clatter, as though ashamed of the lie they'd been ringing. She did not announce herself. She announced the problem, reciting a time that could not have happened unless the bells themselves conspired. I offered denial and received a snort like a spark. She unfolded brass dividers and drew invisible circles in the air, marking distances only she could see. The viaduct length, the incline, the weight that should have cried out on any honest page. We set the pages end to end, and the column of figures became a procession of the dead. Somewhere outside, a child tested a bell mallet, a bright, lonely ping daring night to answer. She said, the road could be righted for a breath if we corrected the manifest. I laughed, and the sound was ugly in the quiet. She plucked the laugh out of the air, put it in her pocket with the chalk, and told me the hour would come again whether I stood in it or not. The window breathed frost. I watched my breath and thought of steam. We climbed to the bells because arguments must be heard from their source. The foundry smelled of burnt salt and oiled rope, and the towers were ribs for the town's iron heart. The child who kept watch there spoke as though repeating instructions received in a dream, saying the 11th wanted to be true, and that the others dragged it back. He handed me a key bound with wire and told me not to drop it between the stones. Things sleep in narrow places and wake hungry. From the belfry we watched the viaduct cut the night like a ruler, and stormlight stitched crooked seams across the valley. Far below, the Wayhouse seemed no wider than a nail head. I listened to the ring fade and heard in its echo the thin whistle the world tries to forget. The key burned cold against my palm, and for a moment I imagined it unlocking my throat. When the hour returned, clouds had lowered to kiss the parapets, and the town held its breath like a guilty choir. I waited at the Wayhouse because distance had only sharpened the pull. The rails wore rime that crackled when I touched it with the key, and the cold ran up my arm to settle in old scars. The whistle arrived before the engine, a blade drawn just out of sight. Steam curled along my boots, made of nothing and yet heavy enough to leave damp crescents. He appeared again on the step, hat brim throwing a neat shadow over eyes that weighed and did not judge. The ticket lay in my pocket like a sleeping bird, but when I touched it, it looked back, and I knew the ride would not simply carry me. It would erase and write. The bells stuttered their quarrel, then found the line they had lost. When their voices braided into 1111, the door unlatched itself. The ledger resisted like a locked jaw, refusing to open beyond the page where the ink had been combed into obedience. We read the numbers aloud as if they were prayers for the dead, and the room answered with the dry cough of parchment, brittle and offended. The figures wanted to add, but each sum bent sideways, as though weight had been scraped from truth and pasted to profit. On the margins were scratches that looked like wheel ruts, and a faint gray dust that tasted metallic when the candle guttered. She kept her voice even, measuring breath the way an engineer measures distance, and I tried to keep pace with a heart that still ran the stairs to the weighhouse. Outside, the towers let slip a single off-key note that found the knot in my spine and tugged. We traced the falsified hour with a blade of light from a lens, and the reflection struck the cracked crystal in my pocket and returned as a tiny, accusing sunrise no one else could see. The foundry door opened on heat and hammer song, a sanctuary of sparks where the town's heartbeat was forged, one strike at a time. She who ruled that fire did not waste a greeting. She presented a lockbox clothed in soot and wire, said it had waited under the bell mold since the night the road broke. The key from the tower found its throat with a click that sounded like an oath remembered, and inside lay a silver whistle, its chain knotted with a ribbon the color of dried blood. When I lifted it, cold leapt from metal into bone, and a memory unfurled. The same mouthpiece pressed between my teeth while the world tilted and rails screamed. The foundry mistress watched without flinching, as if weighing me against the bell in the frame, measuring if I would crack. The engineer chalked a circle around us on the soot-black floor, murmuring that a line drawn true can turn back a fall for the length of a held breath. Night returned like a verdict. The towers quarreled themselves into agreement, and the air thinned until each breath felt borrowed. At the weighhouse, steam curled out of nothing and found our ankles, possessive as a cat that knows your door. She nodded once, and I put the whistle to my lips. Sound leapt from it like a wire hurled across a canyon, stitching one moment to the next. The engine shouldered into being with the tired grace of a monarch rising for duty. The door eased open, and the man in black descended a single step and paused, as if manners still mattered to the dead. His voice was iron striking water, clean, cold, absolute, asking for a manifest that had been made to lie. My hand trembled with the ticket's heat, and the candles along the platform collapsed into tears. He did not accuse. He scheduled. Correct the list, align the hour, return what was stolen from the rails. I said yes, before courage knew it had spoken. We climbed to the belfry to bargain with the hour itself. The child who tended the ropes listened to the wind the way sailors listen to sails, then told us the quarters had been bullied into false company, that the 11th would ring true if given a partner. He gave me a mallet far too small for the weight of the bronze, said to strike not the lip, but the heart, and let the note climb rather than fall. We waited for the clouds to thin their ranks, for lightning to write brief arithmetic across the valley. When the hands met, we struck together. Wood, rope, bell, bone, and the sound leapt outward like a thrown stone, ripples touching cliff, viaduct, weighhouse. For a breath, the world fell into step. The rails seemed to straighten within the fog as if remembering their youth. The boy smiled with the terrible calm of those who hear what adults pretend not to, and the tower exhaled the dust of secret years. Dawn threatened but withheld itself, leaving the town in the blue that makes truth look colder than it is. We spread the rescued pages on the shrine rail between iron nails and guttered candles, and the wind flattened the lies for us like a stern clerk. Names unrecorded reappeared in ghost lettering when the first gull cried. Whites corrected themselves when the whistle kissed the air. Time stuttered and resumed in a less forgiving cadence. We made a list not for merchants or magistrates, but for the road, cargo that burned, orders that shifted the crossing, lives that were never meant to be freight. I pressed my thumb into red wax and sealed the new page with a seal that was only my skin. She wrapped the whistle in cloth and looped copper wire around the bundle, as if binding a wound. When the towers cleared their throats for mourning, we were not finished, but we were scheduled. The catacombs opened like a throat beneath the guild hall, swallowing torchlight until the flame learned humility. Salt glass candles hissed along walls, tattooed with sigils that had forgotten their meanings. Every step set off a whisper of rust, as if the floor rehearsed our trespass in advance. We moved between aisles of tools retired from honest work, bell molds, gauges, dividers, arranged with the piety of relics and the guilt of evidence. Air tasted of old rain trapped in stone. Far off, water kept a clock more trustworthy than the towers, and with each drip the past advanced one pace. We found a door shaped like a ledger, narrow, stubborn, bound in iron thongs. The key from the shrine hesitated, then chose us, and somewhere above, a bell misstruck and apologized to the night. When the lock consented, a draft rose cold and metallic, carrying the tang of a secret that had waited too long to be named. Inside waited a desk bolted to the earth, as if truth might otherwise bolt for the door. Ledgers were stacked like bricks to wall out consequence, and on the topmost, a red seal wore the bite of a ring too proud to hide its teeth. We warmed the wax with breath and courage until the ribbon surrendered, and the page below unfolded a geography of ruin. Cargo renamed to silence, weights lightened by ink, passengers reduced to margins, where prayers go to thin. A sigil stamped at the bottom shifted when the torch moved, like an eye that hates to be caught. The order that doomed the crossing had not been written by the weather or the river. It had been timed with purpose. A knife slipped between minutes to make a pocket where blame could sleep. I felt the rails scream return in my bones, not as memory, but as a line drawn through marrow. The seal ring's imprint lingered on the page, like a bruise no apology could fade. The first flake fell like ash and rang against the cover, a sound too delicate for stone yet heavier than dust. More followed, a slow snowfall of iron filings turning the air grain by grain into a grindstone. The flame drew a thin breath and narrowed, as though a great mouth had leaned closer to taste. Patterns formed on the ledger's edge, coils, links, vertebrae of a thing that had learned hunger from the shape of rails. The floor tilted without moving. We stood inside the moment when wheels leave obedience and the world forgets its balance. The filings flowed around our boots in quiet streams, obedient to a magnet hidden in the dark. Somewhere beneath the arches, something woke and drew a chain across its ribs to make certain it remembered pain correctly. The torch guttered, recovered, and drew a bright line down the page, dividing the lie from the list of the dead. We did not speak because the air had begun to judge. She worked quickly, translating terror into geometry. Circles countered coils, lines cut hunger into measured segments, copper wire bridged gaps ink could not close. Each figure whispered a cost and she paid in breath, steady as a metronome set to defy panic. The page of names, men and women smudged to arithmetic, lay between us like a body awaiting rites. I held the torch lower and saw the chalk dust rise, illuminated like frost, struck by moonlight in a room that had never known a window. The filings rallied, testing the edges of her pattern, and when they met the chalk, they flowed aside, resentful as water encountering oiled wool. She traced a final glyph and said the road could be bent back for a heartbeat. Only if a living witness took the weight at the moment of breaking. The word weighed exactly what it meant. I heard distant bells count to a number that did not exist yet, and feared it would soon. We closed the ledger because it had told us everything it would, and began to plan for a second that wished to devour us. The pattern on the floor ticked like a watch you hear only when the room quiets enough to hear yourself. Somewhere underfoot the river turned in its sleep. Somewhere above, a tower rehearsed the wrong time and corrected itself, ashamed. The whistle lay wrapped in cloth, heavier now that it knew the work expected of it. We spoke in the grammar of action: rope, tether, break, step count, pretending that discipline could tame doom if listed properly. Then we stilled, recognizing the lie of comfort that lists provide. The choice was not if, but when. And the answer wore the same numbers as the ticket in my pocket. We left the catacombs with the kind of silence one carries out of a chapel, the kind that makes the city sound louder. The wind met us with the smell of rain that has studied stone for years and chosen its moment. The storm came back wearing its old uniform, rain hard as buckshot and wind that tasted like hammered coins. The hour found us waiting where the iron road first remembers itself. And when the bells agreed upon 11:11, the world pressed a seal against the night and opened. The engine rose from vapor with the dignity of a funeral that refuses haste. She worked fast, looping copper from my belt to the platform stanchion, testing knots with the same tenderness others reserve for wrists. He appeared on the step, hat brim shedding water as evenly as judgment, and offered no speech beyond the tilt of a gloved hand toward the carriage throat. I felt the tether's weight, the whistles cold beneath cloth, and the note inside my ribs that wanted to match the wheels. We moved, not as volunteers, but as parts already machined. Wood underfoot, iron ahead, a window of minutes, narrowing to the size of breath. When the door latched behind us, the storm fell an inch quieter, the way a crowd hushes when verdicts are read. Inside, the carriages held their loops like lungs, holding breath. A woman adjusted a veil she had already perfected. A boy balanced a drum he would never strike. A merchant rehearsed surrender to a ledger no longer here to accept it. We moved among them as intruders to a ritual, careful not to disturb the choreography of endings. He glided ahead, each footfall timed to music we could not hear, guiding us through the narrow cathedral of seats, toward a steel wheel asleep at the car's far end. Fingers traced rivets, counting heartbeats. Lips shaped numbers because numbers make courage sound practical. The windows offered the valley as a pale smear, rain stitching diagonal lines across the glass until the world became graph paper for catastrophe. He rested his gloved hand on the brake, housing like a blessing withheld. When our reflection aligned in the window, living, dead, and the decision between, we saw the curve that had no patience for apology coming up fast. The door at the carriage end unlidded the night. Wind struck like a thrown net. Rain came sideways, full of filings that needled skin with memories of iron. The viaduct curved ahead, a single brushstroke across the abyss, and beneath it the dark breathed like a lung that never learned mercy. She was a knot of will at the platform's edge behind us, boots planted, hands whitening on the tether, as if she could muscle the future into a straighter track. The line hummed, a sound between him and whetstone, and the thing that hated confession paced the curve with us. A shadow braided from chains and wreckage, eyes where no eyes should be counting down a second, eager to arrive. Boots found their measure on slick boards, fingers found purchase on cold steel. The tether lifted off the deck with the tautness of a held oath. He angled his body into the wind and nodded once, a metronome resetting us to intent rather than fear. The brake waited like a confession booth. Metal shrieked under my palm as if remembering other hands and refusing to forgive them. The wheel shivered with a will that was not mine. He stood opposite, a counterweight of patience and precision, guiding breath, guiding pressure, a wordless catechism of torque and timing. I leaned, felt the axle argue, felt the tiny give that says a giant has blinked. The curve rose into our faces. Rain braided itself into ropes that tried to drag us off the deck. The tether sang high and thin between worlds. For a heartbeat, the wheels loosened their allegiance to disaster, and the engine's weight shifted as a truth too long postponed tried to stand. Beneath us something vast hissed disappointment, and the carriage quivered like a hunted animal deciding not to break. Then the wheel snapped back, bit, and held. And the second we had borrowed demanded change for the loan. When the curve released us, it did not grant pardon, only parole. The engine sighed as if dragged from a nightmare. It was not ready to leave, and the windows flooded with faces that might finally learn a different last sight. We backed through the aisle, muscles fluttering with the aftershock of borrowed strength. He paused at the step and lifted 2 fingers to the brim in a salute, both military and mournful, then looked to the tether, drawing a wet line from my hip. To the world we intended to keep. The door opened on rain that had worn itself to mist. She met us halfway, hands quick with copper, eyes calibrated to catastrophe and survival in equal measure. We stood 3 points of a triangle on a platform that had become a hinge, and the bells far above shook water from their throats to say the hour yet lived. The ticket in my pocket warmed. The second manifest in my head stopped whispering and began to speak aloud. Morning pretended innocence, but the square had already chosen sides. The black-robed authority marched into the foundry with a procession of incense and iron, calling the whistle blasphemy and the bells accomplices. Sparks snapped like angry birds in the smoke light as townsfolk backed toward anvils and chains, hands open, jaws set. The forge's red heart throbbed, while orders clattered against the stone like thrown shackles. He raised a ringed hand, blessing the seizure with words that smelled of oil and dust, and men in mail moved to unpin the clappers as if cutting tongues from the city. We stood within a chalk mark laid the night before, too thin to be a wall, yet stubborn as a vow. Tools waited like tame animals that might yet bite. The child hovered by the rope, in stillness learned from storms. The maker kept her hammer low but ready, weighing whether to speak steel or mercy. When the accusation finally reached me, the room seemed to lean toward the doors as though breath itself wished to escape. The tower answered with wind enough to skin the cheeks. We climbed while the square filled with shouted scripture and metal assurances, and on the platform beneath the bronze mouths the city's nerves converged. The child spoke the ledger of tones again. Heart, lip, rim, damping. Then set the rope in a pattern that taught the bell to remember itself. The maker stationed apprentices at the winches, distributed nails like vows, and told them to sing if they could not swing. Below, men tried to quiet what had already learned to speak. Above, thunder wet its throat. We pulled in cadence that had survived wars and weddings, letting the sound roll through rafters as a spine through a body. The engineer crisscrossed ropes with copper, tying arithmetic to breath, pinning the 11th note where the others would have swallowed it. When a ladder rattled with climbing mail, sparks leapt from the clapper's kiss, and I thought of the curve on the viaduct, and how a town can be bent back the way a wheel sometimes will. The road called, jealous of our delay. We ran the parapets between tower and wayhouse, rain sawing the space thin, and the rails below shone like wet scripture. Something immense paced the valley's edge, impatient with arithmetic that preferred truth to fear. Filings rose and drifted as though gravity had been promoted to suggestion. At the platform the door yawned, and he stood within the glow that has no source but duty, no benediction, only a gesture that held both farewell and command. I felt the wind find the tether at my belt and pluck it like a string that knew our names. He removed his gloves with the ceremony of surrendering a post and placed them in my hands, not as a gift, but as a license. Their weight was the heft of responsibility, the exact mass of a second about to change its mind. Behind us, the bells found one another in the dark, a procession resolving into a single spine. Ahead, the curve waited with predatory patience. The ring-bearer arrived last, dragging authority like a chain. He leveled words at the whistle swaddled in cloth, announcing the object's death, as if killing sound could erase consequence. The maker placed herself between decree and metal with the steadiness of an anvil that has seen too many hammers. The child tightened the lattice that rebuilt the hour, each knot a small prayer that preferred mechanics to miracles. We answered accusation with labor, aligning marks, weighting ropes, scribbling countersigns on wet stone. He lifted a brazier as judge and executioner and ordered the relic cast in. Sparks cackled, eager to be cruel. Before I knew I'd moved, my hand was in the smoke, lifting the bundle free, heat biting through cloth and skin. The crowd's breath pulled tight enough to make a seam in the world. He called me traitor to the peace of forgetting. I said nothing. The bells spoke for me, striking in a sequence that tolerated no edits. Night clenched into a single intention. The towers fell into rank one by one, the 11th note threading them like a needle through cloth. The city's heartbeat became a measured countdown that left no place to hide. We crossed the parapet toward the waiting door with tools cinched, copper biting at hips, the wrapped whistle thudding against ribs like a second heart. The storm dropped to a hush that meant it was listening. He waited on the step, edges already thinning as duty prepared to change uniforms. No speech, only the space he made for us to pass. The gloves fit with the shock of inevitability, and I felt the break through another man's history, as if bone could learn a stranger's past. The platform sighed under our weight, and the rails gave a faint, tired cheer. Somewhere in the valley a chain moved, testing its old argument. We did not pray. We scheduled, and the schedule was to ride. The bells reached the number we had prepared. The door accepted us. The hour uncoiled like a sprung spring, and the carriage learned the slope of doom again. Wind pressed its verdict through every seam. The deck lathered itself in rain. The wheel of the brake thrummed beneath gloved palms, as if it remembered stronger hands that once failed. The pattern chalked into metal by quick fingers earlier in the night glimmered where water could not wash it clean. A geometry that refused to drown. Ahead, the curve lifted its white lip and bared the abyss. Beneath, the valley drew breath to welcome falling iron. The lamps along the aisle sank, flared, then steadied, as though the dead had agreed to share their light for a price. A whisper threaded the storm, not voice but intent, describing the shortest path from weight to ruin. There was no room for elegance, only leverage. Shoulders locked, feet squared, breath counted. When the bells struck 11:11, their spine aligned with ours, and the wheel yielded a fraction, the dimension by which catastrophe might be edited. The world above answered, or it did not. And for a breath it seemed it might choose silence. Then the towers lifted their throats and spoke in a cadence hammered straight through bone. Each mouth took its note, passed it to the next, and the 11th threaded them like wire through stitched flesh. Ropes burned palms. Clappers kissed bronze with the intimacy of knives. The square below pitched into argument that could not drown the music. Somewhere a decree broke like glass underfoot. In the belfry a lattice of copper turned sound into arithmetic, and arithmetic into a key, and the key into a door held ajar. Sparks leapt where rain met heated metal and fell as harmless stars. The child counted not seconds but intentions. The maker drove stakes of will into timbers already old with history. Far off, a seal ring lifted to bless a lie, and found no voice left to wear it. When the final overtones settled, the curve ahead lost an inch of appetite. Wait, argued back. The deck heaved, no higher than a breath, no smaller than fate, and with that motion something immense slid along the outer dark, matching speed, matching hunger. It arrived as the shape of a verdict, scales of plate and chain articulated around a furnace that had learned to imitate a heart. It did not speak. The metal around us spoke for it, rails whining in a harmony that promised forgiveness to any confession properly misplaced. The strands of rain bent toward its pull. Filings lifted from puddles and orbited like bleak constellations. A bargain entered the marrow. Accept a clean ledger written in smoke and keep breathing, or name the stolen cargo and let breath join steam. The wheel shuddered under hands that had lost the right to shake. A gloved grip tightened, a shoulder lowered, and a thought took shape with the calm of a prayer that believes itself unnecessary. There are seconds one must pay for with the body if words are to live. Names are rails too, and when laid true, they carry more than steel. The page in memory opened of its own accord, each line a life, each entry a weight, each seal a thumb pressed hard to make a bruise the world could pretend not to see. The throat that had learned to swallow guilt opened instead to recitation. The storm thinned to listen. The lamps steadied as if the dead refused to miss their roll call. Cargo hidden under false titles found its proper shape aloud. Orders timed for darkness were returned to their hour. The signature that had stolen a second from the city was read with the plainness of daylight. With each word, the wheel turned a fraction smoother, an axle shaking off rust it had never earned. The thing in the dark raked chains along stone and found no purchase where truth laid its track. Lightning stitched the valley from cliff to cliff, and, for a heartbeat, the road appeared straight as a vow. Impact arrived and did not. Wheels screamed the old sentence and then, caught between bell and breath, between cipher and confession, skated into a new clause. The carriage pitched to the memory of falling and then discovered a grammar where descent was no longer the verb. The tether sang not as a warning but as a tightened seam holding two worlds together. The chalk pattern flared and spent itself like a soldier who salutes once and is gone. The deck leveled by the breadth of a coin. Windows filled with faces that had only ever learned endings, now forced to read past the period. Sound peeled away in layers. First the iron's wail, then the storm's applause, then a silence that felt like a city relearning how to inhale. Somewhere far off, a ring struck stone and did not rise. The wheel halted with a final half-turn and waited, as if shy of victory. The door at our backs unlocked itself without being touched, and the hour held still long enough to choose. The engine sighed to a halt, as if a great sentence had finally found its period and could rest. Doors folded back, and the night uncurled from its fists. Faces that had only practiced dying learned an awkward, beautiful new rehearsal. Stepping down, they came in silence, each loop loosening like a knot soaked loose by rain. Hands that had gripped luggage now touched railings as if feeling bark for the first time. Eyes that had memorized a last sight blinked at a world that chose to continue. He stood at the step, the hat brim making a small shelter no storm could improve upon, and watched as duty released its captives. Steam fell as gentle weather. The rails did not gleam with appetite but with fatigue, like muscles after a hard climb. Somewhere in the town a bell discovered it could ring without trembling. I felt the gloves weighing my hands, and did not yet know whether to keep them or return them. I only knew the second had been bought and paid for, and the receipt was breath. Morning pulled color back into the world as if retouching a faded icon. We carried the corrected page up the switchbacks, wet stone clicking under boots, and the square filled with the kind of silence that chooses to hear. The ring-bearer tried to speak the old arrangement of fear into place. His words met the hour we had retuned and broke on it like waves against shaped rock. Names were read aloud, not as accusations but as returns. Weights were given back their heaviness. The order that had stolen a night was held up to daylight until its ink grew shy. Hands that had raised hammers for him now lowered them to rest on their own thighs. The child's rope work above stitched the bells into a spine of agreement, and the maker's gaze never left the man who had called erasure a sacrament. When he reached for the seal as if to bless the crowd back into obedience, no one knelt. Even the pigeons stood taller on the eaves. Truth does not shout. It accumulates. The ledger from below, the seal's bite, the ghost of a timetable. That cairn of evidence became a staircase no rhetoric could descend from. We walked its steps in words plain enough to stand unarmed. Cargo named, orders timed, signatures compared by scar and flourish. He answered with smoke, but even smoke must choose a wind, and the bells had given the morning one direction only. When the crowd finally moved, it was not a riot but a tide. Hands that had forged bells and cut stone and stitched sails reached for sleeves and ring hand and gathered him without hurry, the way a town gathers a fallen beam before it crushes something soft. He looked small then, a man discovering the difference between power and permission. I felt no victory, only the ache that follows a tooth's removal, space throbbing where hurt had lived. The gloves tightened and then loosened, as if considering whether they belonged to me or to the hour. At the wayhouse, the last of the steam lifted like blessing. He waited by the shrine of iron nails, where candles had guttered into little lakes, cap tucked under one arm as a gentleman lays aside rank. No speeches remained between us. The noise had been spent where it belonged. He considered the gloves on my hands with an affection that did not ask for return, and nodded toward the rails, as if to say they were finally lines again, not teeth. I set the gloves upon the rail the way one sets a book back, where its margin notes can still be found by those who need them. He placed his cap upon the shrine and touched 2 fingers to it. Ash loosened from his coat not as decay but as harvest, the dust of work complete. When he looked at me, gratitude made a very old thing young. Then the wind took him the way a strong tide takes a lantern's reflection, first stretching it, then thinning, then leaving only the surface, brighter for the loss. Dusk returned, shy of thunder, and the 4 towers took their marks. We stood at the edge of the platform where nights had learned to repeat themselves, the chronometer heavy in my palm like a story I no longer wished to reread. The town held its breath out of habit and then, like a body remembering a gentler rhythm, let it go. The bells spoke the hour with no quarrel in their mouths. Across the valley, the viaduct wore ordinary light. Stone was stone, not prophecy. I set the cracked timepiece among the iron nails and the wax scars, a small offering to a mathematics finely balanced. The seconds stretched, unfurled, and did not summon a door. The wind came through with nothing to carry but the smell of rain somewhere else. She leaned against my shoulder, not as a brace but as a proof. Night continued. We did not listen for a whistle. We listened to the absence of one, and found it merciful.